There is something bigger going on in this BBC lawsuit than one documentary edit. We are watching power trying to set rules for information space, and doing it across borders. On Monday, President Donald Trump filed a suit in federal court in Miami seeking up to $10 billion from the British Broadcasting Corporation. The complaint is 33 pages, and it is built as two claims at once: defamation and the claim under Florida law that bans deceptive and unfair trade practices. His lawyers attach $5 billion to each count, and they demand a jury trial. The trigger is a documentary segment that aired in the United Kingdom shortly before the 2024 US presidential election, inside the BBC Current Affairs brand Panorama, described in the filing as part of a program titled Trump: A Second Chance. The lawsuit focuses on how the program used footage from Trump's January 6, 2021 speech delivered near the White House before the Capitol attack later that day. Trump's lawyers say the BBC spliced together two separate moments of the speech and presented it as if it was one continuous appeal, stitching the instruction to march to the Capitol together with the phrase "fight like hell," while omitting lines where he told supporters to protest peacefully. The claim is not that the BBC criticized him. The claim is that the BBC manufactured a false impression that he directly called for violence, and then broadcast that impression as if it was what he said. What makes this story combustible is that the BBC already conceded something important about the impression created. After internal concerns became public, the corporation issued an apology and a retraction, acknowledging that its edit unintentionally created the impression viewers were seeing one continuous section rather than excerpts from different points, and that this gave the mistaken impression that Trump had made a direct call for violent action. The BBC said it had no plan to rebroadcast the documentary on its platforms, and it rejected the idea that it had committed defamation. The episode became a major internal crisis for the broadcaster, and it contributed to resignations at the very top. Trump now uses that apology as fuel, but he pushes harder. He argues that the BBC showed no real remorse, made no meaningful institutional changes, and that the edit was part of a deliberate political operation to damage him and influence an election. So even if you dislike Trump, or you think January 6 remains sane, the geopolitical angle is clear. A sitting US president is treating a foreign public broadcaster as an adversary that can be disciplined through American courts. And the BBC is not just any foreign outlet. It is a publicly funded institution tied to a license fee and a charter obligation to be impartial, meaning any big legal payout would immediately become political inside Britain. By filing in Florida and by using consumer deception language, Trump is testing a method that goes beyond personal reputation. He is testing whether law can be used as leverage to reshape editorial behavior. And that is why this case matters beyond Trump and beyond the BBC. It is also not a random escalation. A month earlier, Trump's team threatened a defamation suit unless BBC issued what they called a full and fair retraction and compensation. And the broadcaster responded with a written apology from its chair to the White House. In that retraction, the BBC said that two excerpts came from different points in the speech, almost an hour apart, and that the cut gave the wrong impression. At the same time, the BBC insisted there was no legal basis for a defamation claim, and it denied wrongdoing beyond the editorial error. Trump's new filing treats that as not enough, and it uses language like false, defamatory, disparaging, inflammatory, and malicious depiction, while calling the edit a brazen attempt to interfere in an election. That framing is important because it moves the story from media standards to political legitimacy. And once you do that, compromise becomes hard. And notice the venue. This was not filed in London, it was filed in Florida, which signals the goal is not only to win on merits, but to impose cost, discovery, and reputational pain on the institution itself, on its executives, and on any platform that distributed the program to Americans. For Britain, this is uncomfortable because any settlement would raise question whether license fee payers are effectively underwriting foreign political litigation. For America, it is uncomfortable because it tests how far US courts become arena for political messaging rather than simple dispute resolution. Now, if we strip away emotion, the legal terrain in the United States is brutal for any plaintiff who is a public figure, and Trump is as public as it gets. To win a defamation case, he generally must show not only that the impression was false and damaging, but that the BBC acted with what American law calls actual malice, meaning they knew it was false or they acted with reckless disregard for truth. That standard exists to protect press from being punished every time it makes mistake. So the BBC can argue the broader narrative of January 6th is not invented, that the documentary was substantially true, even if one cut was clumsy, and that an editorial error is not the same thing as malicious lie. It can also argue there was no measurable damage because Trump's words and role on that day have been debated for years, and it can point out that the program was not broadcast on US terrestrial television, so American jurisdiction is a stretch. Trump's side tries to bridge that gap by pointing to modern distribution, streaming subscriptions, online viewing, and American consumers who could access the content. And there is another quiet motive. In Britain, defamation claims must be brought quickly, and once that window closes, you are out. So filing in the United States can function like detour around the closed road. All of this means the case may be uphill in strictly legal terms, but politically it can still be effective. Litigation is not only about winning, it is about forcing discovery, forcing depositions, forcing internal emails to be produced, and forcing executives to spend their lives with lawyers. This is where the analogy helps. It is like engineering pressure test on a pipeline. You pump the pressure very high, not because you want pipe to explode, but because you want every weak joint to reveal itself, and you want every future builder to remember the cost of a weak joint. Even the threat of that test can make institutions overcorrect, and that overcorrection is often the real goal. BBC is already under political fire at home about perceived bias from different sides, and now it must fight on American legal terrain too, where discovery is invasive and public. Notice also the choice to add a consumer deception style claim. Defamation law is hard in America, so adding a trade practices claim is an attempt to reframe journalism as product sold to consumers, where misleading edit becomes deception. It is a creative move, and courts may still say it cannot be used to end run around First Amendment protections. But the mere filing shifts the conversation. Suddenly, the question becomes, if a broadcaster sells a documentary through subscription distribution, do the normal rules of advertising and consumer fairness attach? This is exactly the kind of argument that can scare corporate partners, streaming platforms, and insurers, because it threatens their business model, not just their editorial pride. Then there is the pattern. Trump has made media fights a central political tool for years, and lawsuits are part of that toolbox. Even when cases are uncertain, they produce apologies, retractions, and sometimes settlements, and that teaches every newsroom that a headline can come with legal price tag. For his supporters, it looks like accountability. For his critics, it looks like intimidation. And for foreign broadcasters, it looks like America exporting its culture war into their institutions. Britain has its own dilemma here. BBC is publicly funded and politically sensitive, and any large payout would land as domestic scandal. Some British officials are already saying the BBC was right to apologize for the edit, but also right to oppose legal action, stressing that it is an independent organization. In other words, government does not want to fight Trump directly, but it also cannot look like it abandoned the country's flagship broadcaster. So this lawsuit becomes a diplomatic irritant without even trying. It sits in background when Washington and London talk about security, intelligence, trade, all the hard issues, because now there is this sense that US leadership is willing to go after British institutions on American legal terms. And this is where ordinary viewers should be skeptical of simple narratives. Yes, media must be held to standards, and splicing that changes meaning is not harmless. But if the penalty for any controversial edit becomes existential litigation, the result is not better journalism. It can be bland journalism and defensive journalism. Investigative work becomes lawyered to death, and the public gets less truth, not more. That is the trade-off hidden inside this whole drama. So, what happens next? In court, the first fights will likely be procedural. Jurisdiction, where the case belongs, whether Florida trade practices theory can even apply to documentary editing, and whether the complaint can clear the high constitutional threshold for defamation against a public figure. BBC will say it apologized for an editorial mistake but did not lie with malice, and it will argue the program was largely accurate and the legal system should not punish news judgment. Trump will say apology proves falsity, and he will push for discovery, because discovery is where pressure really lives. The tougher question, the one nobody wants to say out loud, is not did BBC like Trump or not. It is this: do we want an information world where political power can use American courts to discipline foreign media? And do we want a media world where editors feel free to splice speeches in ways that change meaning? Because both things can be true at the same time, and both can damage democracy. If you want my judgment, the safest rule is boring but necessary. Show the context, show the full clip, label the cuts, and do not create false continuity. Once a broadcaster starts manufacturing continuity, even by mistake, it hands ammunition to every politician who wants to call journalism propaganda. For viewers, watch a few indicators. Watch whether foreign broadcasters start geo-blocking politically sensitive content from US audiences to reduce legal exposure. Watch whether streaming platforms add heavier disclaimers or refuse to carry certain documentaries not because they are false, but because they are risky. And watch whether this legal style spreads, where leaders use consumer protection laws as new route to attack critical coverage. If that trend grows, you will see fewer sharp documentaries and more sanitized storytelling, and trust will fall even further. In the end, this lawsuit is not only about Trump versus BBC. It is about how fragile the public story becomes when both politicians and broadcasters treat narrative as battlefield rather than as shared record.